June 22, 1941. The greatest offensive in history has just begun. A fully confident German army descends on the Soviet Union, hoping to completely defeat it in a few weeks. By the first week of July, Army Group Center alone issued a statement announcing that they had already captured almost 300,000 prisoners, and had put some 2,500 Soviet main battle tanks out of action. The total number of prisoners that would reach among the three army groups until the end of the campaign in December 1941 would reach 2.5 million. Even so, and despite all these losses, to which must be added a similar number between dead and wounded, the Red Army was able to withstand the German onslaught, being much larger at the end of the campaign than at the beginning. The questions that we are going to see next, based on the most recent studies, are: how was the Red Army able to increase in size despite the millions of casualties suffered? How was it possible for them to recover from such a military disaster and continue to organize one defensive line after another? What happened so that the Soviet Union, far from collapsing, ended up being stronger? Well then, let's see it. As the German army moved deeper into Soviet territory, its divisions began to wear down from the natural actions of combat, and gradually became weaker. To compare it with a graphic example, we can imagine a large drop of water that is diluted as it descends through a window. Although the German army had reserves to cover its casualties, these were soon reduced to zero. In addition to these few resources that Germany had, as its army advanced, it was increasingly difficult to get supplies to it due to the enormous distance and poor communications. This was another factor that accelerated the weakening of the German divisions. Finally, and before beginning the analysis of the Red Army, we have to indicate that the presence of partisans in the German rear, as well as pockets of unsubdued Soviet resistance, made the Germans have to divert more troops than expected to these actions. On the other hand, we have the Red Army that, far from weakening, did nothing but increase in size. One of the keys to understanding this is what happened during the 1920s and 1930s. And it is that during these 2 decades the Soviet state had developed an internal system, in which all men did military service. Later they went into reserve, and the Red Army remained composed of a small number of soldiers, which could quickly be expanded when necessary. Germany, on the contrary, did not have these reservists since, due to sanctions, it could not implement compulsory military service for men between 18 and 25 years of age until 1935. This means that when recruiting new troops, they had to give them a complete military training from scratch, before sending them to combat units at the front. When the German invasion began, the Red Army had 14 million men in reserve, who had received military training and who were available to organize new divisions and armies. To give us an idea, only during the first 2 weeks since the beginning of hostilities, the Soviet state had already mobilized more than 5 million of these men, whom it was equipping to form new units. During the month of July 13, new Soviet armies would enter service, and in August another 14 more would do so. Although, as is evident, these armies, which had to be formed quickly, did not have the same combat capacity as the more professional armies that had already been overwhelmed by the Germans, they fulfilled their function. This is because its function was to entrench itself, and launch attacks from all sides, to force a war of positions and attrition, which would buy the Soviet Union time during that summer of 1941. To see this recovery capacity in a much more detailed way, we have to indicate that on June 22, the Red Army had about 5,300,000 soldiers. By the end of August, and despite the numerous losses, their number reached almost 7 million. And by the end of December its size was 8 million soldiers. All this despite the 4.5 million casualties suffered during this entire German invasion operation. Another significant aspect that also played a very important role was the Soviet capacity to relocate its industry and continue with an increasingly high rate of production. Practically overnight, they managed to dismantle and transport entire factories to the interior of the country, putting them into operation almost instantly. To give us an idea, when the hostilities between Germany and the Soviet Union began, the Red Army had almost 24,000 combat tanks. Although more than half were completely outdated, Having been produced during the 1920s, they were still a considerable force. As paradoxical as it may seem, the great destruction and capture that the Germans made of all this obsolete material led them to the conclusion during the first weeks that they had triumphed and the end of the Red Army was very close. This encouraged them to continue entering Soviet territory more and more, before the expected final victory. To see it in a more detailed way, the production of the Soviet Union during this year of 1941 would change completely. During that year, and despite the fact that part of their industry had to be transferred, they had a production of 4,740 tanks, 8,000 planes, and 55,000 pieces of artillery and mortars. Of this number of tanks, 65% were T-34 or KV-1 type models. For the following year, they were able to produce more than 24,000 tanks and 25,000 planes, compared to 9,200 armored vehicles from Germany and 15,000 planes of all types. However, we cannot stay with this figure, because for that year of 1942, the United States had already agreed with the Soviet Union to send a lot of material of all kinds. Also, by the end of 1942, the Germans will be actively fighting the Western Allies. If we look at the total production of the United States, Great Britain, and the Soviet Union, we see that the figures increase a lot, making any comparison ridiculous. Compared to the 9,200 armored vehicles and 15,000 aircraft that the Germans managed to produce in 1942, the Allied bloc reached the figure of 60,000 and 97,000 aircraft. With World War II at this point being a contest to be won by attrition, it was clear who would be the ultimate winner. One last point we want to allude to is the large presence of partisans on the Eastern Front. This was due to the large expanse of land that made effective control over it very difficult, and because the Germans had great difficulty completing their encirclement of Soviet troops. This meant that when a large number of enemy soldiers escaped, they roamed the area organizing among themselves, and recruiting all kinds of civilians. To end this video, I want to bring a note made by Halder himself at the beginning of August 1941, after a month and a half of operations in the Soviet Union. At the beginning of the war we had calculated that the Red Army had a total of about 200 divisions. We have now identified more than 360. These divisions are not armed and equipped in a similar way to ours, and tactically they are very poorly led. But in any case, those divisions are there, and when we destroy a dozen of them, another 12 appear in their place instantly. The Soviets are favored by the factor of time and space, since they are close to their own centers of power and production, while we are moving further and further from ours. Well, so far this program in which we have tried to make a summary as complete as possible on this matter. If you want to expand on the topic, I recommend the live show we did with Carlos Caballero on Operation Barbarossa, and of course this book by David Stahel. We say goodbye here. Many thanks to everyone, especially the sponsors who make this possible. Subscribe and share this program if you liked it, and see you in the next one. See you soon.